For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini, and award-winning journalist and author Kevin Bloom joins me to discuss the book he co-authored with Richard Poplak, Continental Shift, A Journey into Africa's Changing Fortunes. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Sane.
Can you please tell us what you were trying to achieve in writing this book?
We were trying to answer the question that had occurred to us when we were up in northern Namibia in 2006. And we were in a town called Rundu, and we managed to get across the Kavango River into southern Angola. It was 4 years after the end of the Civil War. And we were taken around this little village called Calais by a former MPLA soldier who had put down his AK-47 4 years previously at the end of the war. And he showed us how his hometown, his village, had totally transformed. There used to be 7,000 people in the town. There were now 35,000 people. There were schools that were functioning again. There was electricity. They had just built the Calais Hotel. The Calais Hotel had a functioning restaurant. There was satellite television in the restaurant. There was goods, products on the shelves in the stores. And there was life, and it was really vibrant. And what we were seeing was definitely growth, but we wanted to know whether it was development as well. There's a difference between growth and development. And we wanted to know whether a road would link Calais to Luanda, whether there'd be a bridge across the Kavango River into Namibia, so, it would link to Johannesburg eventually. We had this profound question about what development in Africa would look like, and what Africa wants when it talks about development, and where development might take us.
Cool. And from one of the interview I had listened, I heard that your first initial reason for writing the book changed. Can you tell us the reasons why you had to change?
Well, it wasn't the reasons that changed. The reason was the reason I just mentioned, but what changed was the lens. The more traveling we did, the more we realized that the lenses we might have been using weren't adequate. So initially we had a very inadequate lens, and we thought that the way to get into the question would be by looking at Africa's waning white communities, because we thought this would be a subject that at least we'd know something about, and then from there we could get into stuff that we didn't, but that was hopelessly inadequate. After that, our focus became China in Africa. And that was an adequate lens for many years, because China have been the defining phenomenon of the century as far as Africa is concerned. We saw declining growth rates from the 60s to the 90s, when the Western institutions were dominant in terms of setting African agendas. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And we saw declining growth rates over those years. Africa was rendered progressively poorer. When China comes in after the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2000, we see growth rates that sort of track China's growth rates on a graph. They're rising all the time, because Africa becomes the place where China comes to get its resources. And we see, on average, between 5.5 and 6% annual growth across sub-Saharan Africa, the highest growth rates in the world. So that then became our second lens, but even that lens turned out to be an inadequate lens to answer the question of what Africa was becoming. And it got broader than that even. The Chinese lens didn't hold it, and it became this interrogation of Africa through 10 themes that tracked 10 countries. We had visited 16 countries. 10 of them made the book. 16 African countries, plus another 2 countries, China and India, over the last sort of 6 years. So these 10 countries made the book, and the countries that made the book because they evoked a theme that was continent-wide in its application. So we looked at the issue of the middle class in Namibia. We looked at infrastructure build in Botswana. We interrogated the idea of the failed state in Zimbabwe. We looked at Africa's biggest homegrown industry in Nigeria, Nollywood. In the DRC, we looked at the issue of resources. In Ethiopia, the issue of agriculture. In South Sudan, the issue of the world's newest country, which independence in South Sudan was declared in July 2011. And in the Central African Republic, we interrogated the idea of what actually is a country. The Central African Republic is one of the poorest countries on earth. It's bottom of 7 out of 10 of the UN development indicators. So we went there, and we were in the middle of the civil conflict there, of the war there. And we wanted to interrogate this idea of a nation state where you have none of the development indicators that people who live in countries that you expect to be a country would have.
And why Africa?
Because I'm an African, Sane. I'm an African. And my first book was a deep interrogation of South African history and how our history is racialized, and how the violence in South African society might be a necessary tax of that history, and how we might be going through a purge. And that book came out in 2010, and it evoked a lot of the themes that are actually coming up now. After South Africa, and another very important chapter I looked at there was the xenophobic violence. So I spent quite a bit of time sort of in downtown Johannesburg. I spent quite a lot of time with a Congolese family who had been victims of the violence. And while, at the time, and it's been an ongoing theme in South Africa, while white South Africans were deciding whether to stay or go, you had Africans in Congo, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in a range of African countries, in Ethiopia and Somalia, who saw South Africa as a haven. And in my travels across the continent, there was this question always came up: how do we get to Johannesburg? And I didn't want to encourage them to come to Johannesburg because, we have 30 communities, 30 African communities living within 10 kilometers of here, living around the CBD, less, within 5 kilometers of here. And, Johannesburg is the New York of Africa. Wherever you go in the continent, people want to come here. And we're not entirely welcoming. And we don't see ourselves necessarily as part of the African continent in a lot of instances, much to our discredit. And much to our misfortune. I think we'd be richer for it if we did, if we saw ourselves more as part of the African continent.
And you and Richard are both journalists, and I will assume you have different styles of writing or relating on stories. What were the challenges of writing the book or authoring this book?
Yeah, no, the challenges were there, certainly. And what we tried to do was set up a structure where Richard would write in the first person, I would write in the first person, and then there'd be another voice, an omniscient voice that we would write together. And we thought that by doing that, we'd be able to show two different perspectives. And we stuck with that style for a good 3 years. We had to throw it all out. We had the equivalent of 5 or 6 full-size books that just hit the cutting room floor because we stuck with that style. It turned out that it didn't work because Richard and I are not different enough. We were both born in 1973. We were both white Jews from Johannesburg, and we've been friends for a long time. And our perspectives were not different enough, even though our writing styles are very different. So we had to throw all of that out. And actually what we had to do was get out of the way of the story. We had to let the story come first. We had to let whatever our preconceptions were of the things that we saw and the people that we interviewed. And again, we went to 18 countries and we interviewed over 600 people. We were doing this for 6 years. And it came a point where we had to get out of the way and let these stories tell themselves.
You might have encountered a lot of challenges while traveling. Can you share a few of those challenges while you were traveling?
Yeah, I mean, there were certain scary moments. The most challenging moment was a day in the Central African Republic where we hired an old 4x4 to go from Bangui to a town called Bambari, and Bambari was on the fracture zone of where the civil war was. This was the front line, and we had gone deep into rebel territory. There were no journalists there at all. The French Foreign Legion was there, the UN was there to an extent, and there were child soldiers at all of the checkpoints, and it was dangerous territory, and we broke down 3 times that day, and the third time we broke down, we knew we weren't going anywhere. But that was a big lesson, because we had 2 options. Once you get out the car and you're in rebel territory, and you're clearly an absolute foreigner. So my lesson from it, and I think Richard would agree, was you either get out of the car with fear, in which case you're disrespecting the people whose backyard you're in. You're disrespecting them by fearing them. Or you get out the car and you show the respect to these child soldiers of being human beings, and of being in a situation that's not entirely in their control. And actually, when we did that, we were helped out to fix the car, and we were okay. I mean, it was a scary situation, but like I say, it was a major lesson. It was actually almost an epiphany.
And who would you be expecting to read the book most?
As many people as possible. I mean, I want Africans to read this book. We're all from this continent, and this is a story about our continent. It's a story written by people from this continent. There have been some good books about Africa written by Europeans, and some written by Chinese, and some written by Americans. But the most important literature to Africa, I believe, is the literature written by Africans. And this specific book is, it's a work of narrative nonfiction. We back up the facts. It's got 60 pages of notes. And at the same time, it's, I believe, very readable and accessible. It gives you the history. You can't go into the DRC, for example, and try to tell the story of mining in the DRC without telling the story of King Leopold. You can't tell the story of this continent without giving the background of colonialism. You can't. And even before colonialism, what was there before? A country like the Central African Republic, before the French arrived, was a major civilization. You had boats going up the Obangi River that held 200 people. You had major sophistication. Benin City, when the Portuguese arrived there in the 15th or 16th century, they couldn't believe the sophistication of the city. They couldn't believe how peaceful it was. They couldn't believe the architecture. They couldn't believe the art. They couldn't believe the pure human aspiration and will that had built this amazing city. The walls were the most beautiful, highest walls that Portuguese traders had ever seen. And the British razed Benin City, which is in modern-day Nigeria, to the ground in 1897. And there's no museum to the city. It's almost as if the memory of this continent has been erased. And it's a travesty. It's an absolute travesty.
And which country was the most interesting for you?
They were all interesting. They all have... Every African country, every African culture has its own uniqueness. So that's an impossible question to answer. I mean, there were some countries that unfortunately didn't make the book that were fascinating, and hopefully we get to tell those stories. For example, a story in Zanzibar, in Stone Town, about a young Chinese man from the Nanjing Foreign Languages Institute, who for the first time in his life, after he had left Nanjing, and just to get into the Nanjing Foreign Languages Institute, you have to be one of the smartest guys in the world, because they accept 1 in 20,000. And he got in there and became fluent by the age of 18 in English and German. He spoke some other languages. He's and Mandarin was his home language. And at the age of 19, being this very talented guy in languages, he goes to southern China to a excuse me, to a town called Guangzhou, where for the first time in his life he sees a black African, and he's blown away. And he goes and introduces himself to this person and says, "What do you speak?" And I think the guy spoke Hausa. And so Yu Ning went off to the University of Hamburg and became fluent in Swahili and Hausa. And we hooked up with him when he was on the island of Zanzibar, putting together the world's first Mandarin Swahili dictionary since 1935. And we were walking around the interior of the island of Zanzibar with him. Now in Swahili, there's 3 words for hump. And these humps refer to the different types of cattle. In Mandarin, there's 1 word. And he was trying to deal with, on an ideographic level, Mandarin deals in ideographs, with how you translate this. And that for us was the sort of social and cultural coalface of where China meets Africa. And it's an amazing story. And Zanzibar's got an amazing history. Not a pretty dark history. I mean, as a slave trader's sort of hub, and the East African coast going back into the Arabic slave trading. But before that, what came down the East African coast was the biggest fleet of ocean-going vessels the world would see until World War I, and this was from Emperor Yongle of China, who had sent 30,000 sailors down the East African coast in 1415, that far back, 100 years before the Portuguese arrived, 85 years before the Portuguese arrived. And they just came on a fact-finding mission. So you find all this Chinese porcelain up the East African coast. And the Chinese decided not to colonize because they didn't want to. The Portuguese came and they sort of needed the resources, and the Europeans needed the resources. So, I mean, this history is just fascinating. I could talk forever. I don't even know what was your question.
Okay, it sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
And for people who might say they are afraid of visiting some of the African countries because of what we hear on the news every day, what conclusion did you come up with after touring Africa?
No, I mean, I think fear is a useless emotion. It's useless. I think fear drives a lot of African conflict. I think fear drives the xenophobia in this country. Fear drives the media. And this is not to say that these conflicts aren't happening. They are. But they're happening because of fear. So I think fear is a useless emotion.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was Kevin Bloom speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the book titled Continental Shift, A Journey into Africa's Changing Fortunes.